There's been much debate about the benefits and risks of cannabis for anxiety and other mental health disorders, and certainly no shortage of stigma around both. With rising levels of anxiety, cannabis and especially CBD are becoming popular options for treatment. Dr. Mark Ware is a professor at McGill University, vice chair of the Federal Legalization Task Force, and chief medical officer at Canopy Growth, here to help us sort out fact from fiction. Dr. Ware, thanks for sharing your expertise with NewsPoint today.
Thank you very much for having me, Sharon.
Cannabis has been used therapeutically for centuries. It was criminalized in Canada in 1923, legalized 95 years later. How did cannabis get such a bad name?
I think it's important to look back at the history of cannabis prohibition. And as you pointed out, the last 100 years has really been a challenging time to unpack exactly what happened to our thinking about cannabis and why. And it's clear that a number of factors took place over that 100 years, which probably gave rise to fears about cannabis, its effects on the brain. Of course, people will be familiar with reefer madness, the idea that cannabis was associated with people essentially going crazy and acting strangely. There were other industrial effects at play. There was the evolution of new pharmaceutical medicines, and the idea of herbal drugs and crude extracts really fell by the wayside as our society moved in the direction of pure pharmaceutical and synthetic medications. So important to recognize that there were also potentially racial aspects. Cannabis was used by marginalized populations, and therefore it was an opportunity for criminalizing cannabis use as a way of getting to underrepresented or marginalized communities. So it's a very complex story, and one that, to be honest, I'm very glad that we are through now.
Well, this stigma certainly has prevented meaningful dialogue until just recently.
It's prevented dialogue, and it's also prevented research, because the prohibitions on cannabis possession extended not just to the individual on the street, but also to scientists and researchers, clinicians, doctors, to actually understand what its potential therapeutic benefits and health risks might be. So these prohibitions really limited our ability to understand what's cannabis' role in health. And again, that's something which, with changing regulations, with a more open dialogue, we can now begin to unpack what is this drug all about.
Well, there are dozens of active chemicals found in cannabis, THC and CBD among the most recognized. What's the difference between the two?
It's interesting because on a molecular level, the difference between THC and CBD is actually very, very minuscule. There's a single bond change in the structure, the scaffold of the molecule. But what that change does is it gives rise to two compounds, both from a similar parent compound, but which have two very different effects. THC, which is probably best known for its euphoric effects, and arguably for most of its medical effects to date, binds to special receptors in the human brain and in fact in many other parts of the body, and has quite well-defined responses. You make that tiny change to the molecule and you have CBD, cannabidiol, which does not have the same euphoric effects, but which is now being understood and is kind of the flavor of the month for having other anxiolytic properties or reducing anxiety, reducing inflammation. But we know this mostly from animal research rather than human trials at this point.
What is that research telling us about the efficacy of CBD and THC for mental health disorders?
Well, for mental health is relatively recent. The idea that THC was a medicine was predominantly looked at for pain management. So pain management, nausea control, appetite stimulation, these were the areas that THC got looked at most effectively. There were early studies looking at THC somewhat as an anxiolytic, so for relaxation as an anti-stress medicine, but it didn't evolve down that pathway in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it's only in relatively recent years that we're beginning to look at THC as possibly having these effects in anxiety predominantly. Of course, with the story of reefer madness, there have always been concerns that THC may also be associated with worsening mental health issues. And in people with susceptibilities to mental health problems, with a history of psychosis or schizophrenia, that it may actually precipitate or precipitate an early evolution of a mental health illness. So getting the balance right with THC between possibly helping and possibly harming is something that we're still trying to understand. With cannabidiol, or CBD, the concerns around the possible mental health worsening issues are much less because it doesn't have the same effects on the human brain as THC does. And what we're beginning to understand, and based on some research that in fact goes back a number of years to Brazil, that CBD in high enough doses may have some very powerful anti-anxiety properties, as well as, interestingly, antipsychotic properties. And these are now also areas that are receiving a lot more attention.
Well, how exactly does CBD react within the body?
So a great question. And it's probably fair to say that where THC is a little bit of a single target drug, it hits a specific receptor. CBD hits a wide range of different things. It affects multiple different receptors in the brain. Some of this mechanism is still being elucidated, but it appears to have a widespread effect on a multitude of different receptors and different systems, which gives rise to these rather paradoxical effects on inflammation, anxiety, seizures, movement, and so on. So there's no single obvious common pathway for CBD to act at this time, but it does appear to work in the areas of the brain where you would expect to find drugs working for things like convulsions, for anxiety, and for psychosis.
Well, there are actually hundreds of cannabinoids in cannabis. Where is the research heading today?
I think the research now is really essentially trying to understand two things. One is, as you point out, what's in the plant itself. These are complex botanical mixtures. And when people talk about cannabis as a single thing, it's a little bit of a mistake, because cannabis really, depending on the strain, depending on the type of administration, whether you take it orally or you inhale, it has multiple different compounds that are being made available to the body in different levels. So it's quite a complex mixture. So understanding what's in the plant and how it gets into the body is one thing. The second part, of course, is understanding how those drugs, once they get in, are interacting with our systems, with our other medications that we may be taking, and with the pathology that we may be treating or trying to treat. So really, it's two different pathways, the plant science and the clinical science that we're trying to establish. And when you get into a complex mixture where there are more than one agent, the possible interactions between these compounds, the way that they affect each other, the way they affect them, other drugs, it becomes extremely complex, which is another reason why it's been very hard to study. Teasing out a complex mixture like this into single components, which is what science likes to do, and then understand how those individual components act, then putting them all together into a standard mixture and looking at how those standard mixtures work. This is all very, very challenging to do from a purely methodological standpoint.
Well, it's like the new old frontier. Dr. Ware, thank you for an update on the 6,000-year history of medical cannabis.
No, it's my pleasure. And I think it's fair to say that we're beginning another 6,000 years of discovery, hopefully turning the clock on, or turning the page on a period of time when we really put the kibosh on cannabis research. We're now reopening that story. And I hope that we can continue to explore new ways that this plant can help humans live a better quality of life.
We so appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.